Europe's economies had already been hard hit for some time, but now America was joining them. After returning to the gold standard in 1925, the Bank of England had needed to keep its interest rates high in order to maintain this standard. This, however, led to an overvalued pound. The British pound, at this point, is the world's reserve currency. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Federal Reserve had kept rates very low. By 1929, the Federal Reserve had come to believe that credit was flowing far too easily. They began raising rates in February, and again in August. It was a difficult financial situation for the world. The United States and Europe had become far more integrated. Germany's economy was abysmal, and they couldn't keep up with the payments that Britain needed. The United States, for their part, relied on large credit investments they had made to Britain. In order for America to be repaid, Britain would need payment from Germany. That same year, British mergers and acquisitions magnate Clarence Hattrey announced his greatest project ever. He would conduct a grand merger of steel investments with American steel companies. However, in order to finance this grand project, he borrowed against fraudulent collateral, some duplicated, some worthless. Rumors began to spread. Sensing that the facade was shattering, he desperately sought out new financing. He went to the Bank of England, who turned him down. After his rejection, he went to Lloyd's, to be turned down again. By September of 1929, his fraud had been discovered. Shares of the Hattrey Group were suspended on the London Stock Exchange, and though he'd be tried and convicted of forgery and fraud, this would do enormous damage to the London stock market. London, already struggling, had now had its market crash. Only a month later, America's would as well. After the United States market would crash, it would begin to enter a period of a worsening and worsening economy. By 1930, unemployment had gone from 1.5 million the year prior to 3.2 million. More than doubling. Banks began failing, with 1,300 bank failures by the end of the year. The following year, food riots broke out. The country of a chicken in every pot was now facing genuine hunger and widespread. All the while, a severe drought had hit the American Midwest, an area which was responsible for a substantial share of the country's food production. The next year, Congress would create the Reconstruction Financial Corporation. Its goal was to prop up financial firms that were collapsing under this economic state of affairs, in the hopes that this might stabilize the economy. Unemployed former workers of the Ford Motor Company rioted. Many people were killed or injured. Vets of the Bonus Army, a group made up of World War I veterans, would march in Washington, D.C., demanding that their bonuses be paid. The entire country was in a state of upheaval. People were nervous. People were hungry. People had lost the prosperity that they had once taken for granted. The country was in chaos. In July of that year, the Dow Industrial Average would reach a low for the entire century, bottoming at 41.22 points. This was a drop of 89% from its peak in 1929, and in November of that year, unemployment had reached 23.6%. And just as that happened, Franklin Roosevelt would win a landslide election, defeating Herbert Hoover. Many economists have sought to point the finger at the cause of this Great Depression. Monetarists blame a contraction in the money supply, the Fed's failure to lend. They argue that credit wasn't ample enough, and that the Federal Reserve, in not acting as the lender of last resort, simply allowed banks to wither away, destroying the lending market. Keynesians blame a collapse in aggregate demand. They say the loss of confidence, declining incomes, and wages and prices not dropping quickly enough. People simply stopped buying. Debt deflationists argue that there was excessive borrowing in the prior decade, that there was simply too much speculation. A bubble had been created, and that when prices fell, the real value of debt rose, making the situation untenable. Cheap debt had simply become too expensive. Some cite the gold standard and a vulnerable economy. They state that the 1920s economy was always unstable. It relied on reparations being paid by Germany to Britain and France, and Britain and France in turn paying interest payments to the Americans. Austrians, meanwhile, say that the money supply was too loose, and that the entire boom was unsustainable, while social economists cite a more psychological reason, that perhaps this was ultimately herd behavior. Loss of confidence wasn't based on there actually being a reason to be unconfident, but because people became unconfident because others were unconfident. Mob psychology. Ultimately, though, Europe's economy was weak. The British pound was overvalued, and the rates were high. their ability to meet US interest payments did rely on the German economy, and the German economy was collapsing. Shortly before the Wall Street crash, both the governor of the Bank of England and the Chancellor of the Exchequer proclaimed that the American equity market was speculative and a bubble. Yet at its height, its average price-to-equity multiple was 24.3, with a price-to-book of 4.2. Was this overvalued? Perhaps to an extent. But by that point, it was really the only investable economy. So perhaps one could say that too much capital rushed into the US, looking for a safe haven, some place where it could make returns while Europe was destroyed by war. Yet at the same time, American innovation was real, and it vastly outstripped anything that was happening in Europe. New York and London had become highly interconnected. Yet at this point, their relationship had begun to depend on Germany's ability to make reparation payments. The whole financial system was hinging on the German economy, and Germany was not able to make those payments fast enough. Britain, returning to its gold standard and a Bank of England attempting to support this, didn't merely maintain high rates on its own end. It was concerned about gold leaving London for New York. Bank of England Governor Montague Norman and New York Fed Governor Benjamin Strong had a gentleman's agreement. The Bank of England would keep rates high, and the Fed would keep rates low, thus supporting the gold standard and discouraging gold from flowing into New York. Over time, this began to create a problem in the United States, as rates were artificially too low. The Fed had to raise rates. Britain's industry was weak, London was declining, and by 1929, its stock market had experienced a crash. For all the Bank of England's efforts, money left London for New York. Experiencing a large inflow of capital, New York had thus experienced a liquidity injection. Yet, as London financiers would seek to return capital to London, this would cause a large capital outflow from the United States. A large capital outflow while rates were high. Yet for the entire time period, dollar-pound exchange rates were little changed. The dollar was still weak. A weak dollar with capital leaving the United States, rates rising, an enormous amount of loans contingent on the German economy, and an interest rate environment that had been artificially low for years. Ultimately, the American economy was in the perfect place to be disrupted. All it would take would be for more capital leaving the system than entering, and people getting spooked, even if just for a short while. After all, once confidence is lost, it's lost. And now, in the early 1930s, confidence in the United States was the lowest perhaps it had ever been. Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1933, and very early on would call for a bank holiday. He sought time for banks to be able to stabilize themselves to avoid future bank runs. His first 100 days were filled with a flurry of action, and radical action at that. During these first 100 days, the Emergency Banking Act was passed. Civilian Conservation Corps was created, creating jobs in conservation efforts. The Federal Emergency Relief Act was passed, giving direct aid to states. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed. It attempted to stabilize agriculture prices and reduce crop surpluses. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created, creating an enormous regional development project. An idea of his was that public works would provide employment and stimulus. The National Industrial Recovery Act was passed. It created the Public Works Administration and the National Recovery Administration. The Glass-Steagall Act was passed, forcing banks to separate their commercial and retail banking arms from their investment banking arms. This act would also create the FDIC. He would continue much like this in 1934. To date, this was the most radical president that the United States had ever had, and the societal order, as it had existed, was irreversibly changed. So much of Franklin Roosevelt's legacy depends on winning the war. He is remembered as a figure who brought people through the dark hour of the Second World War. Yet during the 1930s, that was not how he was thought of. In fact, much of the country hated him. He was hated by the traditional ruling class of America, and the reasons run much deeper than they stopped being profitable. The entire structure of the United States was changing. Though he would have many supporters amongst the Democratic Party and the upper class at the beginning of his presidency, he would grow to make very serious enemies. It isn't an exaggeration to say that the administration of Franklin Roosevelt constituted a war against the people that had ruled America. America was now in a war for its entire order. Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th of 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. He He was born in his family's estate, Springwood, the son of James Roosevelt, a coal and railroad business magnate. He was politically connected, involved in diplomacy, and was a notable donor. His mother was Sarah Ann Roosevelt, who had come from the Delano family. Their family, both the Roosevelts and Delanos, were very politically connected. They were related to the Astor family. Franklin would be lifelong friends with Vincent Astor. They were also related to the Livingstons, the Scholars, the Van Cortlandts, the Halls, and far more than that. Relatives of the Delano family would include Ulysses Grant and Calvin Coolidge. Originally, the Delanos were from Flanders, their name origin being de Lanois. The first Delano to come to North America would do so in 1621. Their families included mariners, whalers, shipbuilders, bankers, lawyers, politicians, railroad businessmen, and opium merchants, amongst a host of very profitable endeavors. His mother was very dominant, but caring, while his father was older and gentler. In his childhood years, he was tutored at home, where he developed a fondness for stamp collecting, sailing, reading, and generally learning. In his youth, he and his family would frequently travel to Europe, where he learned German and French. By 14, he left to the Groton School. This time at boarding school seems to have made a substantial impact on him. In 1904, he would enter Columbia Law School, but drop out after passing the bar exam. And in 1908, he would get a job with a prominent law firm, Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. 3 years earlier, he had married his fifth cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. The couple moved into the family's Springwood estate, yet Franklin's mother also offered them a New York townhouse, where they would spend much of their time. Shortly after their marriage, they would begin having children, and have a great number of them. However, early into their marriage, Eleanor would discover that Franklin had been cheating on her, which would irrevocably damage their marriage. They would be separated for some time. His son has also indicated that Franklin did a whole lot more cheating than just that. It was around this time that he began to look toward politics. The Democrat Party in New York recruited him to run for a seat in the New York State Assembly. However, the incumbent would ultimately return, but undeterred, he would pivot to run for a Senate seat. He would enter the New York State Senate in 1911, part of a group of insurgents opposed to the political machine of Tammany Hall. In the election of 1912, his longtime mentor and relative, a personal hero of his, Teddy Roosevelt, was running. Yet, he would throw his support behind the Democrat candidate, Woodrow Wilson. This wouldn't lead to ill feelings between him and Teddy, but it would between him and much of the Roosevelt family. They began to see him as disloyal, that he valued politics over family and obligation. Yet, for his support of Wilson, he would be given the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the second highest position in all of the Navy, aside from the Commander-in-Chief himself. It was there that he seemed to start interacting with labor. He observed the way that union bosses and labor leaders would solve disputes. He was impressed by them, and he was intrigued. Only a year later, he would run for an open Senate seat. It should be noted that the career of Franklin Roosevelt is of a man who, at every opportunity, will attempt to leave the office he has just entered in order to climb. This may be the most careerist man who has ever lived. In his bid for Senate, he's backed by the Treasury Secretary and the Governor of New York, but his opponent is backed by Tammany Hall. Wilson isn't able to support Franklin, as he needs the support of Tammany Hall for his own election. He would go on to lose that race, learning that an organized political machine beats federal support. In 1920, he asks Herbert Hoover if he would run for president, taking him on as vice president. This plan ultimately falls through when Herbert Hoover announces that he is a Republican. Yet when James Cox wins the Democratic nomination, he chooses Franklin as his running mate. Unfortunately for the pair, the Republican nominee, Warren Harding, would win the election. At this point, he goes back to law. Shortly after, however, in 1921, while on vacation, he becomes quite sick, so he takes some time for rest and recovery. He withdraws from public life. He begins to spend his time in the South, and although he remains connected to New York politics, he starts developing political connections in the South, connections which he will later use. He starts re-entering politics in the mid to late 1920s, slowly at first, but ultimately, he's back. In 1928, the Democrat nominee, Al Smith, asks Franklin if he would run for New York governor. He agrees. His platform is progressivism. He believes that the governor should have more control of state funds. Utilities should be taken under the control of the state. The state should grant farmers tax relief. He proposes conservation and reforestation efforts. direct relief, and unemployment benefits. He also puts forth the novel concept of old age pensions and insurance, directly making benefit payments to people in old age. He runs and wins on a progressivist platform and the heavy hand of government. Yet, as we have seen over and over throughout his life, he absolutely will not see anything through and will always keep climbing. In 1932, he runs for president. This time he was not approached. He pulls together a group of people to design a campaign for him. He runs on securities regulation, the reduction of tariffs, farm relief, government spending in public works. He pitches a new deal for Americans, that in this economic malaise, the government will bail them out. It's once again the policies of Wilson, but much, much bigger. DNC chair James Farley would serve as his campaign manager, showing enormous institutional support for the candidate. Lewis Howe would be advisor and strategist. He had the support of John Nance Garner, the Speaker of the House, as well as many of the Southern and Western progressive senators and governors. Yet, learning the lesson from his earlier bid, he also seeks out and acquires the support of the urban political machines. As time went on and the Depression didn't abate, he would move to remove tariffs altogether, repeal prohibition, create a tax policy that ratchets far more steeply based on income and wealth, to a point many would call punitive. He would begin antitrust probes and commenced grand-scale public works projects. The government had become deeply embedded in the American economy, yet it wasn't simply the large expense or the antitrust that would draw the ire of America's ruling class. Glass-Steagall was a direct attack on America's aristocrats. Much of the ruling class of the United States was involved in banking, and this act wasn't a warning shot. It was a broadside. By this point, much of his support came from organized labor. The Congress of Industrial Organizations was one enormous backer. Their members included mine workers, clothing workers, automobile manufacturers, steel workers, and electrical workers. He as well had the support of the American Federation of Labor, and while he did have grassroots support, much of his political apparatus came from the rising force of the union bosses and their political machines. Bosses like John Lewis of the United Mine Workers, and founder of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, Sidney Hillman of the Agglomered Clothing Workers, David Dubinsky of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, as well as his own Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins. Yet some financiers backed him as well. Henry Morgenthau Jr., the son of the prominent Henry Morgenthau, would be his Secretary of the Treasury. Vincent Astor, his lifelong friend, Herbert Lehman of Lehman Brothers, and Averell Harriman of Brown Brothers Harriman, amongst others. He garnered grassroots supports from Catholics, and notable support from Catholic clergy. He was supported by the National Alliance of Bohemian Catholics, the Lithuanian Roman Catholic Alliance, the Polish National Catholic Church, and the Slovak Catholic Sohol. He as well had enormous support from Jewish organizations and from Jewish grassroots, attaining nearly 85 to 90% of the Jewish vote. Rabbi Stephen Wise would give him his support, as would many Jewish organizations and prominent Jews, including the prominent Morgenthau family, earning Henry the treasury. And as his administration would continue, his opposition would deepen. No longer was it just America's upper class that felt betrayed by him, but Senator Carter Glass, Senator Harry Byrd, Senator Millard Tydings, Representative Eugene Cox, Al Smith, James Farley, Raymond Moley, and Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. As his administration would go on, many of his earlier supporters would turn against him. He wasn't who they thought he was. They assumed that he was a progressivist, and though his ideas may be bold, ultimately he was still in line with what America always was. John Nance Garner, Huey Long, James Farley, Lewis Howe, the titans of the Democrat Party, all began to turn against him. And if this wasn't substantial enough, so would his family. It seemed that every force that could be arrayed against him was against him. This wasn't merely a political dispute, but an all-out war for what the country was at its very core. For centuries now, the United States had been ruled by one class. Though its membership changed throughout the years, largely this American aristocracy came from the founders of America, from the early Dutch settlers, from the English colonists, and notably some French Huguenots. The group that had built up and ruled the United States was largely continuous, and though the sense of nobility had largely died out in Great Britain, it was still alive in the United States. It was a different culture. Much of the memory that we have of the ruling class of the United States comes from the efforts of the Roosevelt administration, and those of his order afterwards, who have sought to discredit their existence. Now why? Why would something like that happen? Well, because this was a war for power. This was a war for the country. And only one faction could win. The other must be destroyed. A vast amount of the country felt that Franklin Roosevelt's administration was socialist, that it was autocratic, it stifled the American spirit, and was destroying the economy. It was stripping away rights and attempting to destroy everything that America had known. If perhaps not truly communist, then it was the greatest Fabian victory that had ever been seen. On August 22nd of 1934, a group of prominent Democrats and businessmen would form the American Liberty League. Their goal was to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States and to foster the right to work, earn, save, and acquire property, to quote them directly. They would run an enormous amount of publications against the New Deal. They opposed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and the Social Security Act. The former chairman of the DNC, Jacob Raskob, would be among the founding members, as would Congressman Jouett Hughes, Alfred Sloan Jr. of General Motors, and the DuPont family, but their membership would grow substantially. Ernest Weir of Weirton Steel, J. Howard Pugh of Sun Oil, Sewell Avery of Montgomery Ward, Edward Hutton of E.F. Hutton, Nathan Miller of U.S. Steel, and a former New York governor, Will Clayton of Anderson Clayton, Grayson Murphy, a prominent J.P. Morgan broker, John Davies, a very prominent lawyer, banker Robert Clark, Andrew Mellon, who was former Secretary of the Treasury and ran Mellon National Bank. All of the men who had built America to be what it was were arrayed against Franklin Roosevelt. They saw something sinister, not merely idealism, but a direct attempt at subversion. Even outside the core membership, prominent figures like Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan Jr. all stood resolute against Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. They were weary of the elements who had come to form his support base and those who were supporting him, his advisors, and his backers. They saw socialists in the White House and interest groups antithetical to the interests of the United States. And here we begin to see a very curious character. Smedley D. Butler was a retired U.S. Marine Major General who, after a long career in America's wars, had become disillusioned by the entire thing. He began to adopt a socialist view, believing that war was entirely the result of rapacious capitalists, that it was all motivated by profit and scheming. And while his anti-war view was noble, his sense of business and politics was naive and ideological. He was known as a great exaggerator and a flamboyant eccentric. In 1934, he would accuse many members of the American Liberty League of approaching him with a plan to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt's administration. He would accuse figures like Grayson Murphy, John Davies, Alfred Sloan, the DuPont family, General Hugh Johnson, General Hubbard, Thomas Lamont, head of J.P. Morgan, Admiral Sims, and General Hanford McNider. 2 years prior, a group of veterans who had become badly hit by the Great Depression set up tents and camps in Washington, D.C. They were called the Bonus Army. They demanded that bonuses be paid out to them. Butler would go before Congress and would claim that he was approached by Gerald McGuire, a prominent bond broker, to ask him to lead this bonus army, to march on Washington and take over the government. His testimony was investigated and ultimately dismissed, yet to some degree there was truth in it. Perhaps not a grand invasion of the capital, but there was true considerable organized opposition to Roosevelt that were trying to figure out a way to get him out. These men began to look to Europe. They saw the vast changes all around, the impoverished Britain and France, the economic booms in Italy and Germany, the civil war in Spain, and the Soviet government in Russia. They would indeed take inspiration. Many of these business leaders would send their representatives to Europe to learn how countries like Italy had found their way to economic prosperity so rapidly. Later, this would be used against them. Rooseveltists would claim, during and after the war, that they were always fascists, that they simply wanted to create a totalitarian government for their own benefit. But that wasn't their interest. They saw the Depression, and they saw countries work their way out of it. They weren't Nazis. They weren't working against the United States. But during the war, that was the best way for Roosevelt to destroy the image of his enemies, associate them with the national enemy. Yet at the time, this was a decade earlier. The war hadn't even begun, nor would anyone even begin to imagine Germany's camp network. They wanted to find anything that could solve the economic problems. And one thing they noticed is that veteran groups were extremely important in defeating socialist uprisings. So, and certainly not all of the American Liberty League, but some thought that if there were to be a movement against the socialism of Franklin Roosevelt, then it would come from the veterans, and thus, a small civil war had erupted. Veterans, businessmen, the very Democrat leaders who had put Franklin Roosevelt into power, all began putting out publications, appealing on radio, making presentations, attempting to organize grassroots and veterans looking for any way they could to get Roosevelt out. All the while Roosevelt became hardened. He began a propaganda campaign of his own, labeling his detractors as being the royalists of capital, that they were simply interested in profit and they were trying to stand in the way of the great progress of the New Deal. He would label them as sympathetic to the enemies, as greedy, nefarious fascists, who wanted everyone poor so that they could be rich. Now, was this true? No, and he didn't believe it either. After all, that was the world he was born into. But it was an information war. It was a war to see who would stay in power. Only one could survive. And so our memory of these men has been smeared. We do live in the shadow of propaganda. His enemies weren't motivated by profit, nor were they disloyal, and they did care about the United States. His greatest enemies were those who had put him into power. So the country was on a precipice. Roosevelt, supported by union machines, by religious factions, by Catholic organizations sympathetic to socialism, and by Jewish groups who had begun gaining prominence in Great Britain. He was supported by radicals, by labor organizers, and a new progressivist coalition that sought to remake the United States. And the only question would be, who would win? Soon the courts began to move against him. He became reluctant to push anything to the Supreme Court, believing that they would rule against him, but he was undeterred. In 1937, the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill would make its way into the legislature. He had sought out the aid of prominent lawyers, looking for a way to circumvent the court. They presented him with a novel solution. There was a prevailing belief that the Supreme Court was too old, so, using that, Franklin Roosevelt believed that the president should be able to appoint a new Supreme Court justice for each justice over the age of 70 who hadn't retired within 6 months. This would give him the power to appoint 6 new Supreme Court justices. This would lead to a heavy fight in the legislature. In 1938, he would begin purging those disloyal to the New Deal. All this would lead to figures like Al Smith, James Farley, Raymond Moley, and Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. moving against him. It was now total war. In 1929, the Liberal and Conservative Party dichotomy had been destroyed in Great Britain. The rising Labour Party would displace many of the Liberals' seats, taking many of their voters. In 1929, Ramsay MacDonald becomes Prime Minister. He moves to form a national government, gaining support from some Conservatives and Liberals, although in the process, he splits Labour. In 1931, Britain would leave the gold standard, as their economic crisis would deepen. Later that year, the national government, which had increasingly become dominated by conservatives, would win in a landslide, wiping out the official Labour Party for some time. MacDonald would continue as Prime Minister, although his position would become more of a figurehead role. That government would create a new economic policy for the British Empire, beginning the Ottawa Agreements, policies where British dominions would give Great Britain preference in trade, effectively ending the free trade era. However, by 1934, Britain's depression was at a crisis. There was enormous political instability. Parliament would pass the Unemployment Act in an effort to alleviate the distress, but society was beginning to tear. Oswald Mosley would form the British Union of Fascists. More and more of the country was coming to believe that the British way of doing things was insufficient, and that perhaps those on the continent had a better idea. A belief was growing that it was time for radical change. There would be clashes on the streets of London as the British Union of Fascists and British anti-fascist Marxist groups would grow their ranks, leading to Marxists and police fighting on the streets. Though neither fascists nor communists would ever gain much of a position in Parliament, it was a sign. British society was under great strain. MacDonald would ultimately resign as Prime Minister in 1935 and be replaced by Stanley Baldwin. The following year in 1936, the British monarchy would experience the abdication crisis. King Edward VIII would be unable to retain his position as monarch if he wanted to have a marriage with his divorced wife. Britain may be liberalizing, but not enough for the head of the Church of England to have a divorced wife. So, choosing marriage over the crown, he abdicated, leaving the throne to his brother, King George VI. The crown, however, had been declining for some time. The history of British monarchy is one of gradual deterioration, and the loss of power for the crown wasn't a new phenomenon. Almost the entire history of the Kingdom of England and the United Kingdom was one of the erosion of the monarch's power. By this point, under the reign of King George VI, the king was little more than a symbolic figure of ritual. He did retain some powers in theory, but they were never used. In ancient Brythonic Britain, smaller chieftainships had placed great power in chieftains, kings and councils. And in Anglo-Saxon Britain, Anglo-Saxon kings had great power. Yet in 1066, with the Norman conquest, the power of the barons would be asserted. The king would not have total power, but would instead have to mediate between the interests of the barons of the realm. In 1215, under pressure from his barons, King John agreed to Magna Carta. It put forth that the king was subject to the law. It enumerated rights of free men, and stipulated that the king could not raise new taxes without council. In the 13th century, King Edward I would form a model parliament. This parliament would help advise him and approve taxes. Though this parliament wasn't permanent, it set the precedence of an advisory council. Over the following centuries, Parliament's influence would only grow. During the Tudor dynasty, the monarchy would begin centralizing power away from the lords. Much of this centralization wasn't through the monarch directly, but was instead done through Parliament, strengthening its power. In 1628, Parliament would force King Charles I to accept Petition of Right, which would limit the power that the king would be able to use without Parliament's consent. The years of 1642 to 1651 would see the English Civil War. And even after the king was restored in 1660 with the reign of Charles II, he was unable to rule without Parliament. During the 1688 Glorious Revolution, the entire dynamic would be changed. Now the monarch would not simply need the support of Parliament, or to negotiate with it, but the crown would be subordinate to Parliament. The monarch would rule by Parliament's consent. The next year, the Bill of Rights stipulated that there would be no taxation without parliamentary consent. There would be freedom of speech in Parliament, no standing army in peacetime, unless approved by the Parliament, and that Parliament would need to be held frequently. The 1701 Acts of Settlement would set that there could only be Protestant successors to the throne, and the crown's power would be limited more. Once the Hanoverian monarchy began with the reign of King George I, it would really begin to end. He didn't speak English particularly well, and relied heavily on his ministers. This, in turn, moved much of his executive power to his ministers, ultimately leading to a state where executive power resided in the cabinet and not in the monarch. Over the course of the 18th century, the cabinet would become the true executive power and would be accountable to Parliament, not the king. It would be said that the king advises, encourages, and warns. The 19th century would see this develop further, and by the end of the reign of Queen Victoria, she had become little more than a symbolic advisor. Her moral authority was substantial, but executive power would reside in the cabinet ministers, and the cabinet ministers would answer to Parliament, a Parliament with near total control of the government. And thus, by the time that King George VI took the throne, his power was little more than ceremony. Yet still, this abdication would create a moral crisis. The crown was important to the English sense of self. England relied on its king, and while the country was already in such a dangerous, precarious situation, King George would have a very difficult task ahead of him. He was a sweet, committed, and fundamentally good man, but he had considerable difficulty speaking, and at this point, his job was to speak. He would have to learn how to become the moral voice of the nation, and fast. In order to deal with the social deterioration, Parliament would pass the Public Order Act in 1936, prohibiting political uniforms being worn in public. This was specifically targeting the British Union of Fascists. Yet the state of society and the economy didn't get much better. Stanley Baldwin would resign as Prime Minister in 1937, with Neville Chamberlain taking the office upon his resignation. Neville Chamberlain would attempt to avoid war. He had seen the horrors of the First World War, and wasn't willing for Britain to enter another devastating war on the continent. He would do everything he could to make sure that no more young men had to die, yet all the while, trouble was brewing on the continent. The Nationalsozialistische Deutsches Arbeiterpartei, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, had been a small fringe group made up of labor, socialists, and discontent veterans. They had made a violent bid for power, landing one veteran and member, Adolf Hitler, in prison. In 1925, he was released, publishing his book the same year. Adolf Hitler was becoming a more and more powerful figure in the party, assuming many leadership roles. After his release from prison, he began to look for a legal path to securing power. He wanted the party to grow with the population, to earn public support, and to win in the Reichstag. He would form the Hitlerjugend in 1926, in an attempt to gain the support of the youth. They would grow the next year, and by 1928, they would win 2.6% of the vote, earning them very little political power. Yet the following year, the Wall Street crash would devastate Germany, as Germany was reliant on American loans. There was mass unemployment and unrest, far beyond anything that America or Britain would see. On October of that year, the NSDAP would join a coalition of conservatives and nationalists in the Liberty Law campaign in a move against reparation payments. In 1930, Heinrich Brüning would become chancellor. Assuming emergency powers, the bulk of executive power would be shifted to the chancellor, which had historically been a weak position. Later that year, the NSDAP would win 18.3% of the vote, making them the second largest party in Germany and making them a true political force. As the economy would continue to weaken, their support would only grow. The NSDAP, which at this point would begin getting the nickname the Nazi Party, felt that Germany had been betrayed, that the handling of the First World War and the ensuing revolution, the entire structure of the Weimar government, was at the hands of those disloyal to Germany. That they shouldn't even be in this terrible state of affairs if it weren't for people within Germany who had moved against its interests. They rejected this democratic and parliamentary system. They rejected Weimar altogether. They believed that Germany could leave poverty. All it would need was will and strong leadership. They pointed to internationalists, the financiers of Berlin and London. They argued that the German economy had become geared to international finance and not to the interests of the German working class. But more than that Germany had lost its sense of being a people. Often people assumed that he spoke aggressively and angrily, but instead he spoke in a passionate way, and with a tone more akin to a sense of loss. He spoke of betrayal, and that the German people needed to find their identity, needed to rise up, that the great German Empire had been reduced to an impoverished, deracinated, and shameful state by internal enemies, by Marxists, and by Jews. He spoke of unity, strength. He described a strong state, bound together by the ethnic identity of Germans. But perhaps most impactfully, he spoke of pride. It was pride, he argued, that Germany had lost. More than wealth, more than even the war. Germany had been a once great empire, yet it had allowed itself to be reduced to a universally ridiculed nation. That perhaps more than anything else, Germans needed pride in being German once again. To the impoverished and distressed nation, this message resonated very powerfully. In March of 1932, Adolf Hitler would run for president against Paul von Hindenburg. He would lose, but he would achieve substantial national support. Yet only a couple months later in July, they would rise to become the largest party in the Reichstag, achieving 37.3% of the vote. The institutional conservative parties were facing a political crisis. They feared a collapse of their coalitions and a collapse of the Weimar government. So, believing that they could control him, thereby getting the radical elements on the side of the government so that they wouldn't be a concern anymore, Paul von Hindenburg would appoint Adolf Hitler as chancellor. He didn't believe that this would lead to any real power, but more just get the radical elements out of the way. However, by March of that year, the Enabling Act would be passed, after national crises would culminate in the Reichstag fire. This would give Adolf Hitler as chancellor almost total executive power. He could bypass the legislature and the president. On July 14th of that year, all other parties would be banned. In 1934, he would conduct a purge of other Nazi Party members, and the Night of the Long Knives, securing his position in the party. And on August 2nd, after the death of Paul von Hindenburg, he would combine the offices of president and chancellor, making his position Führer und Reichskanzler. And with the military pledging their loyalty to him shortly after, he was an absolute monarch. The following year, the Saar region would vote to return to Germany. Rearmament and conscription would begin again, in defiance of the Versailles Treaty. Later that year, he would begin enacting policies designed to solidify the German identity in law. The Nuremberg laws would be passed, strictly defining German identity within the law and limiting the legal status of other groups, particularly Jews. In March of 1936, the Rhineland would be remilitarized, and Britain and France would do nothing. In October, he would begin drawing closer to the Italians, forming the Rome-Berlin axis, as the two countries would become increasingly aligned. And in November, he would enter into the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan in an effort to mutually combat communism. In 1938, he would annex Austria and move heavily toward a policy of the unification of all German peoples. And in September of the same year, Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, and Édouard Dallier would agree to the Munich Agreement. After Germany had annexed the Sudetenland, it would be agreed that this move was acceptable, so long as Germany didn't make any further moves for additional land. Much like Germany had had since the days of Prussia, there was a belief that prosperity was to the east, and there was a belief that for Germany to be strong, it must be a united Germany of all the German peoples. Britain, for its part, wanted to do everything it could to avoid a war. There was some unease at the militarization and the annexations, but, after all, these were Germans, they thought. So long as Germany didn't move any further beyond that, then all was well. Though at this point, the more hawkish in Britain began to call for direct military action. Among them was Winston Churchill. Neville Chamberlain was beginning to get squeezed, and slowly Britons realized that they might be returning to war on the continent. Back in Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain took a position of fiscal prudence. Prior to his position as Prime Minister, he had been Chancellor of the Exchequer. He argued for a balanced budget and the reduction of debt, as well as the reduction of taxes and the prioritization of stability in the economy, that this could lead to economic recovery. He as well made a series of social reforms, such as public health initiatives, housing initiatives, as well as the creation of an unemployment assistance board. He favored a strong centralized government aimed at recovery and stability. Yet perhaps more than anything, he wanted to ensure that there would be no new war on the continent. Yet, at the same time, he did begin cautious rearmament. He was cautious of the expense that this might mean for Britain, but did want Britain to be prepared in case conflict did arise. He was backed by the Conservative Party establishment, by the population who were opposed to war, by many businessmen, and the royal family. His opponents were war hawks, the Labour Party and the Liberal Party. He was also fiercely opposed by many intellectuals and journalists, as well as Jewish groups who wanted him to move more aggressively against the Germans. Some of his fiercest critics were Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, and Duff Cooper. The aristocracy supported him because they liked his peace position, his policy for stability, and his anti-communism. Finance and industry liked him for his policies of stability and for his low taxes. The middle class supported his anti-war stance and his policies of economic stabilization. Same with many professionals. The working class was more mixed to him, but there was large support for his anti-war position, even if many tended to favor labor. Overall, at least in the beginning of his prime ministership, he had wide support from almost the entire country. In September of 1936, he would return from a meeting with the French and German leaders, stating that he had achieved peace in our time. He believed that the Munich Agreement had satisfied the aims of Germany and averted conflict. However, in March of 1939, Germany would occupy more of Czechoslovakia, in violation of the Munich Agreement. This would begin to cast doubts on his diplomatic ability and the strength of his position. By the end of the month, Britain and France would issue a guarantee for the independence of Poland. Yet, despite this guarantee, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany would invade Poland. Germans cited that there were ethnic Germans in Poland who were being abused. While there was support for the Germans in Poland, there was also fierce opposition, and they claimed that this was simply an aggressive move of territorial expansionism, that this was simply aggressive Prussianism once more, and that their sovereignty had been violated. Back in Britain, Chamberlain began to look weaker. However, despite being in a state of war with Germany, little actually happened on the Western Front for some while. It wouldn't be until April of 1940 when Germany would invade Norway and Denmark, seeking the rich iron ore reserves and a desire to control Aalborg and Jutland in order to secure a defense from the British coming from the Atlantic, that Chamberlain would be aggressively challenged in Parliament. Leading a vote of no confidence, Winston Churchill would fiercely attack Chamberlain, and it would work. On May 10th of 1940, unable to form a national unity government, Neville Chamberlain would resign, and Winston Churchill would become Prime Minister. I don't know who the most towering, substantial figure of the 20th century is, but Winston Churchill is certainly a contender. He was born in November of 1874 in Blenheim Palace, the residence of the Dukes of Marlborough, being born of the Spencer Churchill family, although not directly in line to become Duke himself, as the title would go to his father's older brother. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, who was a conservative politician in the House of Commons. His mother was Jenny Jerome, who was an American from a prominent New York family. As a child, Winston did quite well in history and English, although it was noted that he did poorly in Latin and math. He would go on to attend the Royal Military College, where he would train to become a cavalry officer, later commissioning in 1895. In November of that year, he would observe Cuban rebels fighting the Spanish military, and from there, he would develop his interest in war correspondence. He would be stationed in India the next year. A few years later, he would fight in Sudan, taking part in the last great cavalry charge of the British Army. That same year, in 1898, he would publish his book, Story of Malakand Field Force. In 1899, seeking to begin a career in politics, he would resign his commission. He would begin by becoming a war correspondent in the Second Boer War, becoming captured in November of that year. A month later, he would make a daring and very publicized escape. This would begin to earn him recognition from the public. In 1900, he would be elected as a Conservative MP for Oldham, taking a seat in the House of Commons in 1901. Over the next decade, he would serve as Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, President of the Board of Trade, Home Secretary, and First Lord of the Admiralty. 4 years later, in 1915, he would resign as First Lord of the Admiralty. As First Lord, he was responsible for the Gallipoli campaign, an effort to take control of the Dardanelles from the Ottoman Empire. However, the plan would fail. The Allies would suffer enormous casualties, and they would be repelled. The blame would be laid on Winston. In 1917, under the Lloyd George government, he would return as the Minister of Munitions. From there, he would become Secretary of State for War and Air. Later, Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1921, becoming heavily involved with the Middle East and Ireland. Here it can be very clearly seen his Victorian imperial ideology. He has a true classic Victorian-era liberal imperialist view that the more empire, the better the world. However, in the 1922 general election, he would lose his seat. The next year, he would try to run as an independent, but fail. This failure would ultimately lead to him rejoining the Conservatives, and under the Baldwin government, he would be made Chancellor of the Exchequer. There he would remain for some time, until 1929, when Labour would win a victory, and he would leave. He would remain in Parliament, but as a backbench MP. He spent much of his political efforts deriding appeasers. He would join a faction of MPs who made up the hawks of Britain. They believed that Britain should act and become aggressive with Germany, that Germany was expansionist and a threat to the British Empire, that they should stop the German threat now before it metastasized. Yet, in September of 1939, Neville Chamberlain would bring him on as First Lord of the Admiralty once more. And after the Norway campaign, in April of 1940, he would lead a no-confidence vote against Chamberlain, and by May, only 1 month later, he would become Prime Minister. He had great support from Labour and Liberals, powerful politicians like Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, and Sir Archibald Sinclair, the leader of the Liberals. He also had enormous support from the Warhawks, from figures like Anthony Eden, Duff Cooper, and Leopold Amory. Originally reluctant and a supporter of Lord Halifax, Winston would ultimately gain the approval of King George. He was opposed by figures like Neville Chamberlain and Lord Halifax, the anti-war element of the government and population in general, as well as many military and civil service members. They still remembered him as the failure from the Gallipoli campaign, and they doubted his decision-making. His support did have the advantage of being highly organized. Today we take for granted the idea that think tanks and NGOs just are part of the political environment. But back then there was still some novelty to it. The Focus Group was an organization with many powerful members that had been established, specifically to oppose appeasement. Their existence revolved around taking an aggressive stance to stop the Germans. Their full name was the Focus in the Defense of Freedom and Peace. They were largely liberal internationalists. They shared that Victorian sense that the British Empire should have dominion, and they viewed Germany as its #1 threat. They also took many of their members from prominent Jews who were specifically opposed to Germany, and Germany's antagonist position against their Jewish population. Through the Focus Group, Winston Churchill had the support of figures like Robert Cecil, Norman Angell, Sir Samuel Hoare, and Lord Victor Rothschild. The Rothschild, it should be noted, additionally had deep personal reasons for opposing the Germans, as Rothschild assets in Germany had been seized by the Nazi government. Winston had many very powerful supporters, from business and finance. Sir Henry Strakosch, a successful banker, political advisor, South African gold tycoon, and the owner of The Economist. Bernard Baruch, the highly successful American trader, who had become one of the most prominent political advisors in the country, and the media giant, Lord Beaverbrook. At this point, think tanks were becoming a powerful force. Institutions like Chatham House, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Round Table movement, all were becoming very powerful players in the world of politics. Chatham House was dedicated to liberal internationalism, a supporter of the League of Nations. They wanted an international order, and one made in the British image. Winston Churchill, with his Victorian imperial attitude, was a perfect match, and thus they gave him their backing. Powerful figures like Lionel Curtis, Philip Kerr, Arnold Toynbee, and Alfred Zimmern made up this powerful body that was beginning to become a brain of British foreign policy. The Round Table movement existed to develop a policy between Britain and its self-governing colonies. They supported the idea of an imperial union, the creation of a new order between the home country, the Commonwealth, and the territory. It was the creation of a new imperial order in an era where the empire was falling apart. It was made up of prominent figures like Lord Milner and Lionel Curtis. It was also a proponent of the idea of Anglo-Americanism, Anglo-Americanism is an older idea, but it really began to become a political force in the 20th century. Intellectually, it can trace its roots to 19th century Anglo-Saxonism, which was a belief in the intellectual, philosophical, and ideological way of being that was contained within the Anglo-Saxon world and Anglo-Saxon people. It shared many ideas in common with the Victorian imperialists. It believed that the Anglo-Saxon way of living, Anglo-Saxon philosophy, culture, civilization, and institutions was the way forward for a better world. The progressivist movement would take a lot of their thinking from this. They believed that democracy and the institutions of Britain and America shared fundamental principles because they were Anglo-Saxon in nature. As we entered the 20th century, this idea would form into the notion of a special relationship between Britain and the United States. Many progressivists, imperialists, the Round Table, and Chatham House all believed that the institutions of the empire could survive in the United States, that the United States possessed the fundamental Anglo-Saxon germ, that its systems, philosophy, institutions, ideology, and fundamentally foreign policy would be able to live on in the United States, even if the British Empire were declining. Figures like Jack London and Edgar Rice Burroughs began to write on the idea, and in the United States, think tanks began to form as well. The Council on Foreign Relations would support interventionism and internationalism, albeit from an American perspective, but one that was fundamentally Anglo-American, believing in that same imperial ideal, just coming at it from the point of view of the United States. It was made up of prominent figures like Hamilton Fish Armstrong, Whitney Hart Shepherdson, and Russell Leffingwell. These institutions would be backed by powerful finance. Figures like Sir Robert Waley Cohen, John Maynard Keynes, Waldorf Astor, Lord Brand, Lord Victor Rothschild, Paul Cravath, Russell Leffingwell, Frank Polk, Otto Kahn, Owen Young, Sir Abe Bailey, as well as the Beat and Astor families. These groups were becoming the foreign policy mind of Britain. This was the intersection of intellectual, political, and financial power. So with these institutions in place, these power bases in the United States and Great Britain would work with each other, advocate for the same views, and work toward common goals. Churchill and Roosevelt themselves shared many common views. They had the same fundamental ideals, and were in line with the worldview being created by these think tanks. They were both internationalist, interventionist. Though Roosevelt showed strong opposition to colonialism, they were proponents of the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. They were Anglo-Saxonists, and they both had the same media backing. Figures like Bernard Baruch and Harry Hopkins would be close to both leaders, and so from very early on, the two leaders were ultimately working on the same set of ideals, the same views, the same vision, in the same project, both in the same milieu, with the same backers, the same advisors, the same influences, and common enemies. Churchill would become very close with Chatham House figures like Philip Kerr, Arnold Toynbee, and Sir Robert Cohen. He was close with the Council on Foreign Relations through figures like Bernard Baruch, Harry Hopkins, and John Winant, all of whom were close to both Churchill and Roosevelt personally. And from the Round Table, Philip Kerr, Lionel Curtis, and Leo Amory. The two governments were part of the same thing, one institution of the same think tanks, the same backers, the same friends, the same worldview. On both sides of the Atlantic, the United States and Great Britain were now being run by the same thing. It appears that the Anglo-American project had succeeded. Following the German invasion of Poland, Britain had declared war on Germany. In May 1940, Germany would invade Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. On the 26th, Prime Minister Winston Churchill would order the evacuation from British troops in Dunkirk. On June 4th, Churchill delivers his now infamous speech to Parliament, saying, "We shall fight them on the beaches." Only 2 weeks later, France would sign an armistice with Germany. France had fallen, and quickly. On July 3rd, Churchill would order the Navy to neutralize the French fleet that was currently off the coast of French Algeria, out of fears that the Germans could capture it and use it for their war effort. At the same time, Adolf Hitler would begin making gestures to Britain, signaling that he didn't wish to fight them, that he wouldn't invade Britain if they would just stand down. Yet Winston Churchill demonstrates that he is willing to fight alone, even if everyone else has fallen. And thus, on July 10th, the Battle of Britain begins. The RAF successfully fends off attacks from the German Luftwaffe. Yet from September onward, Britain would be subject to night after night of continuous bombing. Germany again would ask Britain to end the fight, using propaganda and making direct appeals to the British people. Yet Churchill is determined, and he is in this fight. In January, he would ask Franklin Roosevelt for aid. In March, Lend-Lease would be passed, supplying Britain with U.S. arms, supplies, and ammunition, all with no upfront cost. Though the United States hadn't entered, it was now clearly on the side of Britain. In June, Germany would invade the Soviet Union. Full war on the continent had broken out. Britain was overwhelmed. Britain was in a dangerous spot. But Britain was undaunted. The Germans were confident and capable. The Soviets hardened and fierce. It was the ultimate war. Americans were largely opposed to the idea of entering another war. The First World War had shaken them so deeply, they were unwilling to see that again. Many groups, all across the political spectrum, across different ethnicities and religions, different wealth classes and occupations, would all come together and oppose U.S. entrance. In September of 1940, Yale law student R. Douglas Stewart, Jr., heir to the Quaker Oats fortune, would start the America First Committee. Shortly before, the United States had entered into a destroyer for bases deal. Britain would receive American destroyers, and in exchange, the United States would get to use their bases, leased to them for a term of 99 years. Many Americans began to believe that this was simply an overture to an inevitable war, a war they wanted no part of. The America First Committee would rapidly grow, expanding to hundreds of chapters in 1941. Its membership would be wide-reaching, with support from prominent Americans, such as Robert E. Wood, the chairman of Sears Roebuck, Kingman Brewster, a fellow Yale student who would later become Yale's president, Gerald Ford, later president, Potter Stewart, a man who would one day become a Supreme Court justice, Sergeant Shriver, the future director of the Peace Corps. It would be backed by Henry Ford, Senator Gerald Nye, Senator Robert Taft, General Hugh Johnson, John Flynn, a prominent journalist, Lillian Gish, a well-renowned actress, Norman Thomas, leader of the Socialist Party of America, Alice Roosevelt Longsworth, the daughter of Teddy Roosevelt, novelist Kathleen Norris, William Regnery, a successful textiles businessman, Robert McCormick, owner of the Chicago Tribune. They would have backing from enormous companies like Sears Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, Hormel Foods, Inland Steel, and Ford Motor Company. Though the group would later be smeared because Charles Lindbergh gave a speech on their behalf, it should be noted that despite the attacks on Lindbergh, he fought in the Second World War. When his political position against Roosevelt made joining the military untenable, he got his own plane to still fight in the war. This group was not anti-American. This group was profoundly and intensely American, made up of members from the right to the center to the left, all who simply wanted Americans to not die like that again, to not see the bare skull and torn limbs of a teenage boy who never saw life get wheeled across the road again on its way for a crying mother to see and be haunted for the rest of her life, to not have another generation wiped out. People can cast a lot of moral judgments in retrospect in a war that we won, but if you're there at the time, and especially if you had just seen what happened in the First World War, when you had seen people come back with half of their face missing, with burns so severe that their faces just looked like bone, when fathers of young children come back unable to speak, leaving little kids to never know who their father was, when men have to seek refuge behind the corpse of their best friend, or when whole lineages end because artillery hit just the right spot, then no, their opposition to war wasn't anti-American. In fact, very few in the country wanted war. In 1940, the Socialist Party of America would run Norman Thomas against Roosevelt. He would run on an anti-war platform, seeing the destroyer deal, amongst other signs, as indicators that Roosevelt intended to bring America into the war. After that race, they would continue to actively campaign against war. The Socialist Workers' Party as well would campaign against it, calling it a capitalist war. Yet in October of 1940, leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party and leaders of the Teamsters Union would be indicted under the Smith Act. 18 would be convicted in 1942. From the right, Charles Coughlin was a priest and an enormous figure in radio. He was perhaps one of the most powerful anti-Roosevelt voices. He described the Roosevelt administration as a communist plot. He and the organization Christian Front would rally Catholics, and Protestants as well, all against Roosevelt and against the war. Yet, in 1939, new laws and regulations would be passed, specifically designed to ensure that Coughlin could no longer speak. And in 1940, the FBI would conduct raids against leaders and members of the Christian Front. 17 members altogether would be arrested. In fact, there were many anti-war and anti-Roosevelt groups, from the right, from the left, and from the center, and many of them found themselves the subjects of FBI raids. Following the Smith Act of 1940, the government would conduct a number of wartime sedition trials. In 1944, a vast number would be conducted, being dubbed the Great Sedition Trial of 1944. The government claimed that the defendants were plotting with the Germans to undermine the American war effort, although the Justice Department would ultimately have to drop those cases. So perhaps you may find the right-wing groups or the socialist groups to be unpalatable, but the Democrat leadership, the most prominent businessmen, lawyers, authors, academics, politicians, professionals, unions, military officers, just about everyone you could think of would be represented in some anti-war group of one sort or another. Yet ultimately, they would fail. In September of 1931, Japan would invade Manchuria. The American Stimson Doctrine would be put forth, saying that the United States would refuse to recognize any territory taken by the Japanese by force. Though there wasn't direct antagonism between the two nations at this point, there was a beginning sense of concern within some American circles about what Japanese expansion might mean. 6 years later, in 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War would be in full force. There was now a substantial war in Asia. In December of that year, Japanese aircraft would sink a U.S. Navy vessel and 3 Standard Oil tankers in the Yangtze River. Japan would apologize for this, and pay to amend for the damage they caused. But the mood in Washington was forever changed. There was a real concern about the Japanese now. In July of 1939, the U.S. would announce that it would terminate its 1911 Treaty of Commerce and Navigation. The rift was now growing deeper, and the United States had taken a position against the expansion of the Japanese Empire. Meanwhile, there was still a war in Europe brewing. In November, Congress would pass the Neutrality Act, now allowing the United States to sell arms to Britain. The policy was cash and carry. Britain must pay up front and must transport the arms themselves. The United States was now a player in the war. In May of 1940, the United States would move its Pacific Fleet from California to Pearl Harbor, as weariness grew about the Japanese Empire. In July, Winston Churchill would appeal to Franklin Roosevelt for aid. During the same month, Roosevelt would sign the Export Control Act into law, restricting the export of defense materials to Japan. In September, Japan would occupy northern French Indochina, and on the 27th of the month, it would enter into the Tripartite Pact, a security agreement with Germany and Italy. Only a few weeks earlier, the United States had entered into the Destroyers for Bases deal, giving Great Britain American destroyers and in exchange receiving the right to use British bases for a term of 99 years. Only 2 weeks later, Congress would pass the Selective Training and Service Act, creating the first peacetime draft that the United States had ever seen. The next month, October 1940, the United States would impose an embargo on steel and iron goods going to Japan. The next month, Franklin Roosevelt would win his third term, still running on a platform of not involving the United States in these wars. And only 1 month later, in December, he would propose Lend-Lease while giving a fireside chat over the radio. He described the United States as the arsenal of democracy. In January, American intelligence would begin decrypting Japanese communications, and in March, the Lend-Lease Act would be passed. America would begin supplying military goods to Great Britain, either by lending them or by leasing it to them, making the financing of war much easier. In April, the American Navy would begin neutrality patrols, searching for German U-boats and reporting them to the British Navy. On the 9th, the United States would establish a protectorate in Greenland, and on the 13th, Japan would sign a neutrality agreement with the Soviets, freeing up their northern fleet. In July, the United States would move Marines into Iceland to replace the British troops, becoming increasingly involved in the war. All the while, on the other side of the world, Japan would move into the south of French Indochina, putting British and Dutch colonies at much greater risk. Shortly thereafter, Roosevelt would order a freeze of all Japanese assets in the United States and order a total oil embargo. On the 9th of August, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill would meet in Newfoundland. Their meeting would result in the Atlantic Charter, designing a post-war world, a new order in the vein of the liberal internationalist Anglo-American vision. 8 days later, Roosevelt declares that the United States would take serious countermeasures if the Japanese continued their expansion. In September, German U-boat U-652 would fire on the USS Greer. It would miss, but as a result, Roosevelt would order a shoot-on-sight order, that if the American Navy were to encounter any Axis vessels within their patrol range, they should immediately fire on them. This was effectively an undeclared state of war. And over the course of October, 2 American vessels would be shot down by German submarines. In one, the USS Kearney, 11 died, and the other, the USS Reuben James. She was sunk, killing all on board. In November, Japanese diplomats would travel to Washington, D.C. America would demand that they withdraw from China and French Indochina. Japan was unwilling to fully withdraw. On the 17th of November, Congress would amend the Neutrality Act, allowing merchant ships to be armed and enter combat zones. And on the 26th, the Hull Note would be delivered from the United States to Japan, ordering removal of forces. The Japanese would see this as an ultimatum from the Americans. At this point, they came to believe that war was inevitable. And on December 7th, Japanese aircraft would strike the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The next day, Franklin Roosevelt would give a speech, describing it as a day of infamy. That same day, the United States would declare war on Japan. On December 11th, only 3 days later, Germany and Italy would declare war on the United States. This was now America's Second World War. Many people have argued about Franklin Roosevelt's intentions with the war. Some claim that he was reluctantly dragged in by Japanese aggression, while others say that he always wanted war and allowed the Pearl Harbor attack to happen. As far back as 1937, he gave a quarantine speech in Chicago. On August 5th, he said that aggressive nations should be quarantined to avoid international lawlessness. Now, while this isn't Roosevelt saying that the United States should fight a war in Eurasia, it does begin to show a thinking of an international order where the United States should maintain certain ways and rules by which nations operate. Though not definitive, it's an early inclination. After the September Munich crisis, in which Germany had seized the Sudetenland, his sentiment really begins to shift to containment. He believes that appeasement doesn't work, and that Germany can only be stopped by military force. At this point, he would begin clearly backing the United Kingdom, and showing his ideological belief in Anglo-Americanism. He viewed nations like Germany and Japan as threats to the international order that he believed in. He believed in an Anglo-Saxonist liberal world order, and believed that if nations like this were to get too powerful, that they would destroy the world that he believed in. His thinking was very much in line with that of Winston Churchill. He was morally outraged by these nations. His firm convictions toward liberalism threatened his belief not only in how the world should be run, but directly upset him on a moral, ideological, and emotional level. He was concerned by trade routes and American access to raw materials, that if Japan or Germany were to gain too much of a strategic territorial advantage, then the United States and Britain would be boxed in, their economic empires at the mercy of the Axis. That this would surely spell the end for American and British economic might. His Anglo-American beliefs inclined him to support Great Britain. He believed in the special relationship, and that the two were inextricably linked. That he couldn't allow the Anglo world to be surrounded. In many ways, there are parallels to the First World War, at least in the minds of Roosevelt and Churchill. They surrounded themselves with the same think tanks. They had many shared advisors, were supported by the same factions of power, and came from the same schools of thought. This was a fight for survival for their order, for their economic prosperity, for the imperial system, and for liberalism. In December of 1941, Japan would invade the Philippines, beginning Pacific combat. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the United States forces put up a valiant fight, but were forced to retreat. In April, United States bombers would launch from an aircraft carrier, conducting a surprise raid on Tokyo. And in May, the Battle of Coral Sea would commence. This battle would be fought entirely by naval aircraft, and would prevent a Japanese invasion of New Guinea. In June, the United States Navy would sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway. Up to that point, the United States had largely been on the back foot. Yet this enormous victory would begin to shift the momentum of the war. On August 7th, the Guadalcanal campaign would begin. This would be the first major land offensive, and would be the start of a brutal 6-month campaign. Back in Europe, on November 8, 1942, Allied forces would begin Operation Torch. American and British forces would land in French North Africa and begin their combined efforts against the Germans and Italians. In January the next year, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill would meet in the Casablanca Conference. They agreed that their policy should be that they would only accept unconditional surrender. In July, Allied forces would invade Sicily and would go on to invade mainland Italy in September. On September 8th, Italy would surrender, yet Germans would occupy Italy and continue the fight. In November, the United States would begin a strategy of island hopping, beginning by launching a costly assault on a heavily fortified Japanese island. This approach would be to move from Japanese island to Japanese island. It was a brilliant, but very costly strategy. And by February of 1944, the United States would begin seeing the success of this campaign, capturing 2 Japanese islands. On June 6th, Allied forces would conduct Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion that has ever occurred. Along multiple points in Normandy, combined Allied forces would invade in an attempt to secure beachheads. This assault would be remembered as D-Day, and it was extraordinarily costly, yet ultimately successful, and the Allies would establish a strategic position. Beginning in June, the Battle of Saipan would begin in the Pacific. The territorial gains from this effort would ultimately allow American B-29 bombers, a position close enough to the Japanese mainland, to begin bombing campaigns. In July, Operation Cobra would commence, and Allied forces would break out from the Normandy beachhead. In August, there would be further landings in southern France, opening up 2 fronts along which the Germans would now have to defend. And on the 25th, Allied forces would enter Paris, taking it from German control. In October, General MacArthur would return to the Philippines, beginning a long campaign to retake the islands. And from the 23rd to the 26th, the American and Japanese navies would fight in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, history's largest naval battle, and a costly defeat for the Japanese. Their fleet was crippled. On February of 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima would commence. This iconic battle would last until March 26th. The small, yet vitally strategic island would be captured by the Americans, although at very steep cost. And from April to June, the last major battle of the war would be fought, in the Battle of Okinawa. It was a particularly brutal fight. The Japanese made heavy use of kamikaze fighters. Losses were steep. Yet during the battle, on April 12th, Franklin Roosevelt would die suddenly, and Harry Truman would become president. Harry Truman wasn't particularly well liked or regarded in Washington, nor was he kept in the loop. And now he found himself thrust into the decision-making of history's largest war. Many of its elements he had never been apprised of until now. On April 30th, 1945, it would be announced that Adolf Hitler had killed himself, though many conjectured that he had secretly escaped for all functional purposes, alive or dead. He was gone. And now Kriegsmarine Admiral Karl Dönitz was left to preside over a Germany on the brink of destruction. On May 7th of 1945, Germany would unconditionally surrender to the Allies in Reims. Beginning in July, Truman, Churchill, Clement Attlee, and Stalin would meet for the Potsdam Conference to discuss the post-war Europe, and there they would decide to issue an ultimatum to Japan: either surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans had figured out a means for prompt and utter destruction. On August 6th, the United States would drop the Little Boy bomb on Hiroshima. The sheer destructive power in this atomic bomb was on an order heretofore unimaginable. And just to really make the point, on August 9th, the even more destructive Fat Man bomb would be dropped on Nagasaki. That same day, the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan and immediately move to invade Manchuria. Only 5 days later, Japan would announce its unconditional surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, a Japanese delegation would board the USS Missouri, an American naval ship sitting in Tokyo's port, and sign formal documents of surrender. The war was over. The war would change the world forever. Though it gets remembered heroically and valiantly, it was also brutal. There were so many deaths, not just in direct combatants, but civilians, towns and cities obliterated. Roosevelt and Churchill would get their global order. The whole world would be transformed in their image. Germany and Japan would fall under the direction of the United States, made to conform to the Anglo-American system. The Soviet Union would reign over Eastern Europe, Northern Asia, and the Caucasus. The Second World War would ultimately become the foundation myth for this era, the story of why the liberal world order is and ought to be, but in its day it was filled with horror, terror, cruelty, destruction, and fear. We look back on this era with a lot of assumptions, and with a lot of hindsight, but it's important to remember just how afraid people felt, just how uncertain it all was when it was happening. The whole world was plunged into horrors seemingly all at once, and the new order would be born out of fire, ashes, and death. So it's worth remembering that these were just normal people who had lived through so much. These were very young men, boys in their teens and 20s, who had to do the fighting. The entire world we know today is in the wake of this war, but ultimately, these were just people trying to make it through the worst horror humanity has ever seen.